You are not separate from the universe. You are its latest experiment in self-awareness. Every atom in your body was forged in the heart of a star. Every breath you take is bound to cosmic history. And every thought in your mind is the universe reflecting on itself. This video traces that story. How nothing became something, how chaos gave rise to stars, how stars became stardust, how stardust became life, and how life became conscious enough to ask, what am I? From the Big Bang to the birth of brains, from quantum strangeness to the mystery of free will, this video reveals that consciousness is not an accident. It is the cosmos looking inward. You are not just in the universe, you are the universe, aware of itself for a brief and miraculous moment. Imagine standing at the edge of a story so large that it holds everything you know and everything you are. It begins in a time that we measure in billions of years and in conditions so extreme that our everyday words almost fail to carry them. Scientists call this opening chapter the Big Bang. It is not an explosion into space the way a firecracker bursts in a field. It is the moment when space itself and time itself came into being and began to grow from careful measurements of the faint afterglow left over from that first light. We now know that the universe has been growing and changing for about 13.8 billion years. This number comes from detailed maps of the cosmic glow known as the cosmic microwave background, which scientists have measured with great care. The start was a state of incredible heat and density. In that first instant, physical ideas that we use today still work. But if we try to push them back to an imagined point of infinite density, the math stops making sense. That is why many physicists say the term singularity as a way to mark the limit of what our current theories can describe. What we can say with confidence is that very quickly after that beginning, the universe was filled with an almost uniform sea of energy and particles, a kind of cosmic soup. In the first few minutes, the temperature and pressure were high enough for the simplest atomic pieces to form in tiny fractions of a second. Protons and neutrons collided and fused in ways that made the very first atomic nuclei. This process is called Big Bang nucleosynthesis, and it left the universe seeded mostly with hydrogen and helium and a tiny amount of lithium. Those first 3 minutes set the chemical bookends that would guide everything that followed. The details and the measured abundances of these light elements match what careful reviews and calculations predict for that early hot phase. After those first minutes, the universe kept expanding and cooling. Imagine a pot left on a very slow stove. At first, everything is boiling and nothing can hold together. As the pot cools, bits of structure can begin to hold their shape. In the same way, the cosmic soup cooled until charged particles could combine to make neutral atoms. This milestone is often called recombination, even though it was actually the first time neutral atoms formed in any lasting number. Free electrons and protons found one another and bound together to make hydrogen. The moment when atoms took hold, let light travel across space without constantly bumping into charged particles. That freed light has been traveling ever since, stretching as the universe expands and arriving today as a cool glow that fills the whole sky. The way the light looks and the patterns inside it carry a record of the early universe, and they have helped scientists pin down the timeline of these events. Careful calculations of the recombination era show how the changing mix of ions and atoms shaped the light that we can still read today. As the universe cooled even further, tiny irregularities that existed in the early soup began to matter. Think of those small differences as tiny hills and valleys in the density of matter. Gravity, which had been a gentle player while the universe was very hot, began to pull more strongly on the slightly denser regions. Over long stretches of time, those small differences grew larger. Regions that were a little denser drew in more matter and became denser still. This is the slow and patient work that built the large-scale structure of the cosmos. When matter fell into the densest knots, it often cooled and collapsed further to make stars. The very first stars were made from nearly pure hydrogen and helium. Because there were no heavy elements to help the gas cool, these first stars were typically much more massive than most stars that form today. Those giant first stars burned hot and fast, and in their deaths, they scattered heavier elements into the space around them. This scattering of newly forged elements is the reason later generations of stars and the planets that orbit them can contain the metals and other heavy atoms that make rocks and life possible. In other words, the first stars were cosmic forges that turned the simple raw material from the early minutes into the richer chemical mix needed for planets and chemistry as we know it. Reviews of work on the first stars and galaxies describe how this change from simple to complex unfolded, and how the first light sources began to shape the universe a few 100 million years after the beginning. If we pause and look back at those early chapters, we can see a steady unfolding from simplicity to variety. The row outline is simple to say in plain words. A very hot, dense beginning set the basic ingredients. In the first minutes, the lightest atomic nuclei were formed. Over tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of years, the universe cooled enough for atoms to hold together and for light to travel freely. Over millions and then hundreds of millions of years, gravity gathered matter into the first stars and galaxies. In turn, those stars made the heavier atoms that would later be needed by planets and by living things. Each step in this long chain depends on the steps that came before. The story is one of gradual unlocking where new possibilities appear when the physical conditions allow them. The seeds for our kind of complexity were present from the start in the sense that the laws of physics and the raw materials were set early on. What those laws allow is a slow growth of structure and chemistry that in the right places can give rise to planets and then to the chemistry of life. In a quiet and human scale way, the atoms in our bodies were once part of stars and once part of the simple sea of particles in the first minutes. Knowing that history changes the way we think about our place in the grand story. It is a gentle and powerful idea that something very small and very ordinary in human terms can be made from the same physical processes that shaped the whole universe. Science does not pretend to have every answer about that beginning. Questions remain about what exactly happened at the very first moment and about details of the earliest phases. Those are active areas of research. Still, the broad picture I have sketched is supported by careful observations of the cosmic glow that fills the sky and by detailed work on how light and atoms behave and by simulations that follow gravity as it sculpts matter into structure. Together, these strands give us a clear and simple narrative that moves from a hot, nearly uniform beginning to a universe capable, after great stretches of time, of making stars, planets, and even thinking beings. I want you to imagine a quiet, wide room filled with dust and soft light. That room is a story that began long before people, a place where the simplest parts of matter learn to gather and to spark. In that slow and gentle becoming, there are places we call stellar nurseries, clouds of gas and dust, where the very first stars were born. These clouds were mostly hydrogen and helium, leftover light stuff from the first minutes after the universe began. They were not heavy with the kinds of atoms you find on Earth. Because they were so pure, the ways they cooled and fell together were different from the star-forming clouds we see today. Modern work by researchers who study the first generations of stars shows that in the first billion years the universe made what are called population 3 stars, and that these stars were typically very large and lived fast, bright lives compared with later stars. Gravity is the quiet hand in this story. When a patch of gas is just a tiny bit denser than the space around it, gravity pulls a little more there, and over long times the pull grows. The gas slowly falls inward and the motion turns into heat. If the gas cannot get rid of that heat fast enough, it will resist collapse, but when it can radiate away energy, the cloud shrinks and the center grows hotter and denser until a seed of a star appears. For the first stars, the way gas can lose heat depends on what is in it. With only hydrogen and helium, there are fewer ways to cool, so the collapsing clumps tended to be larger. Computer models and careful calculations show how dark matter and ordinary gas worked together to make the first places dense enough for stars to form, and that those first stars were often tens or even hundreds of times more massive than our sun. Those giants burned their fuel fast and ended their lives soon, and their deaths began a new chemical story. When the pressure and temperature at a new star's center become high enough, hydrogen atoms begin to fuse. Dot fusion is like a slow and steady joining of light pieces to make heavier ones while giving off heat and light. The simplest start is hydrogen fusing into helium, and that is what powers stars for most of their lives. In the cores of larger and older stars, the conditions can grow even hotter and new fusion steps open. Helium can be fused into carbon when 3 helium nuclei meet in a chain of reactions known as the triple alpha process. Once carbon is present, it can capture more helium to make oxygen, and then neon and magnesium. In even heavier stars, higher temperatures ignite further burning stages that combine lighter nuclei into silicon and finally into iron. Each stage happens in a different shell inside the star, and each supplies the pressure that keeps the star from collapsing for a time. Careful stellar models and nuclear physics together explain these burning stages and the kinds of elements they create inside stars. There is an important turning point in this quiet inside story. Iron is special because fusing iron or heavier nucleino longer releases energy the way fusing lighter nuclei does. When a massive star has built a core rich in iron, the core can no longer hold itself up and it collapses under its own weight in a fraction of a second. The collapse and the rebound of the inner core, together with a flood of neutrinos and violent motions, produce a supernova explosion. The exact details of how the collapse is reversed into an explosion are complex and remained a major research question for decades. Recent theoretical and computational work has shown that neutrino heating and large-scale turbulent flows help launch the explosion, and that different types of massive stars explode in different ways. When the star blows itself apart, the elements that the star made over its life are flung outward into space. Studies of supernova mechanism and models of the explosion show how the heavy elements born in the core and in the outer shells are mixed and ejected. Those explosions do a kind of alchemy on the cosmic scale because they not only scatter what the star already made, they also make new elements in the heat of the blast. New nuclear paths open in the fleeting high temperature and high density of the explosion. Some elements heavier than iron are created when atomic nuclei capture many neutrons in a very short time in a process called the rapid neutron capture process. For a long time, scientists suspected that supernovae were the main sites for these heavy elements. But more recent observations of a nearby neutron star merger and the faint afterglow it produced showed that when 2 neutron stars collide, they can make large amounts of the heaviest elements such as gold and platinum. That discovery of electromagnetic light, together with gravitational waves, gave a direct fingerprint that neutron star mergers are a powerful source of heavy elements. Together with supernovae and other sites, these cosmic events explain where the wide variety of elements in the periodic table comes from. Reviews and targeted observations have tied these ideas into a consistent picture of how heavy elements form and spread. Not every star makes the same mix of elements. Small and medium mass stars that live quiet long lives make some elements through slow neutron capture and through winds that slowly shed their outer layers. Massive stars make lots of oxygen and silicon and leave behind compact cores that become neutron stars or black holes. When a supernova explodes, it carries the products of both the long, slow work of the star and the short, hot work of the explosion. Astronomers compare the predictions of stellar models with the chemical patterns we see in ancient stars and in the gas between stars to understand which stars made which elements at which times. Papers that gather and compare yields from many stellar models show how the chemical makeup of galaxies gradually changes as new generations of stars are born from gas that has been enriched by the remains of old stars. This recycling is why later stars and the planets that form around them contain the heavy elements needed for rocks and for chemistry that can lead to life. The idea of cosmic recycling has a gentle logic. A first generation of massive stars makes the first heavy atoms and then dies in explosions. The heavy atoms mix with the cold gas left behind and make the gas able to cool faster, which in turn helps the next generation of stars to fragment into many smaller pieces. Those smaller stars can live longer, and they can support the slow chemical factories inside them that make elements we find in planets. Over many cycles of birth and death, the simple soup of hydrogen and helium becomes a richly flavored mix with carbon, oxygen, iron, and many others. When clouds made of this enriched gas finally collapse to form a new star and a disk of dust around it, planets and the ingredients for chemistry and life can appear. Observations of stars with different ages and metal contents, together with theoretical work on star formation and yields, show this layered history of enrichment. Imagine for a moment a quiet scene in space where the ashes of old stars drift like a slow rain. These ashes are not dust in the way we sweep from a floor. They are grains of rock and ice and bits of metal made inside stars and flung out when those stars died. Over time, these grains float through cold clouds between the stars and collect into thicker clouds that glow faintly in the dark. Astronomers call these places nebulae, and they are the raw kitchens where new stars and planets begin. The idea that tiny solid grains in space come from dying stars and carry the elements those stars made is a strong piece of modern astronomy, and has been set out in detailed reviews that study how light and matter behave in interstellar space. When a star reaches the end of its life, it gives back what it made. The wind from a dying star or the blast of a supernova scatters atoms into the space around it. Those atoms cling to one another and to tiny seed particles to form grains of dust. Over long stretches of time, whole clouds of this mixed gas and dust form. These clouds are richer than the pristine hydrogen and helium left from the first minutes of the universe, because they now include heavier atoms like carbon, oxygen, silicon, and iron. That extra richness changes how the cloud cools when it tries to collapse. Cooler gas can break into many smaller clumps, and so it becomes easier for many small stars and planets to form instead of only a few giant ones. Detailed studies of the way dust forms and how clouds cool show how the remains of older stars make the building blocks for later generations of systems. Gravity is the slow hand that gathers the scattered pieces. A tiny patch that is ever so slightly denser pulls on its neighbors and draws more material in. Over time, these small differences grow and small clumps become largerones. Inside a protoplanetary disk that surrounds a new star, grains of dust bump into one another and stick and slowly grow into larger pebbles and rocks. For a long time, scientists puzzled over how fluffy dust could become planet-sized bodies without breaking apart. Laboratory work and computer models have helped to show these steps of growth from sticky grains to compact pebbles, and then to kilometer-sized planetesimals, which are the seeds of planets. Newer ideas add that streams of pebbles drifting in the disk can be caught by growing cores so that planets can grow efficiently in what is called pebble accretion. These processes of sticking, drifting, and catching are now well described in modern reviews of planet formation. Because earlier stars left heavier atoms behind, the next generation of clouds cooled more easily and could form many smaller fragments. Those fragments turn into stars similar to our Sun, and often with a dusty disk around them. That disk is the nursery for planets. In disks where there is more metal and dust, the gas can shed heat quicker and break into many pieces, so that planet formation becomes a more likely outcome. It is why astronomers speak of second and third generation stars as more likely to host planetary systems. Observations of many stars and off their disks, together with theoretical work on how gas cools and fragments, support this view and explain why planets are so common around stars like our Sun. Our own solar system grew from such a cloud about 4.5 billion years ago. Careful dating of ancient rocks and of tiny inclusions in primitive meteorites gives a precise age for the first solids in the solar system at about 4,567 million years. These calcium and aluminum-rich grains are like the rings of a very old tree, they tell us, when the first solid bits condensed from the hot disk around the young Sun. The way the ages of chondrules and other early solids fit together paints a picture of a disk that changed quickly in its first few million years and then gradually made the planets we see today. Studies that measured these ages with great care are central to the timeline of how our system formed. As the disk around the young Sun cooled, dust and gas collected into a thin, flat pancake. In that pancake, rocky grains stuck together to form bodies that would become the inner planets, while farther out, colder ices helped build the giant planets. Where a planet ends up depends on its birthplace and the way material moved in the disk. Earth formed in a region warm enough that most volatile ices did not stick, but cool enough that some water-rich rocks could survive. Later impacts from comets and asteroids brought additional water and organic molecules to the young Earth and helped set its mix of materials. The details of how much water arrived when and how the Earth kept its atmosphere and oceans are still studied carefully by geochemists and planetary scientists using isotope measurements and models of early collisions. The heavy elements that let rocks and life exist were made inside stars and then spread into space. When massive stars burn, they build new nuclei through step-by-step fusion reactions so that carbon, oxygen, silicon, and iron appear in their cores. When those stars die, they free those atoms into the cloud that will form new stars and planets. Much of the iron in a planet's core and the silicate minerals in a planet's mantle come from this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth of stars. Meteorites are like time capsules from that process. And when scientists measure the composition of different meteorites, they can trace which kinds of stars and which processes contributed the elements that ended up in our planet. Those measurements show a changing chemical history of the galaxy as generations of stars add more heavy elements to the mix. Simple chemistry began to do surprising things inside the dust and ice. Carbon is a special atom because it can form strong bonds with many partners and make long chains and rings. In cold space and on the surfaces of icy grains, small organic molecules form by reactions driven by radiation or by heat during impacts. We have found amino acids and other organic molecules in meteorites and in samples returned from comets, which shows that some of the chemistry needed for life can happen before a planet even exists. Classic experiments on Earth long ago showed that simple inputs and energy can make amino acids and other building blocks, and modern studies have extended these ideas by showing plausible paths to the kinds of nucleotides that make up RNA. These experimental and observational lines together make a bridge from stardust to the kinds of molecules that later chemistry on a young planet could build upon. Once the simple building blocks exist, water plays a special role because it is a solvent that keeps molecules close and lets them move and react in gentle ways. Warm, salty water pools or the interface of wet and dry surfaces can concentrate molecules and allow them to join into longer chains or to fold in ways that produce functions. Some work points to hot mineral-rich springs as places where the first cell-like structures could form because the minerals and changing wet-dry cycles help assemble membranes and polymers. Other work shows that icy worlds and meteorite chemistry can also make important steps. The honest picture is that the mix of space-made stuff plus the right conditions on a young world make a wide set of chemical paths possible, and scientists are still working to map which paths were most important for life on Earth. Reviews that examine hydrothermal chemistry and lab recipes for assembling life give a careful view of these possibilities. If you step back from the details, the long and gentle story is this. Stars make the heavy parts. Dust carries those parts. Gravity collects dust into pebbles and rocks and then into planets. Impacts and warm, wet places let simple molecules link into more complex ones and sometimes into systems that can keep themselves going and copying. From the ashes of ancient stars through the quiet work of cooling and sticking and falling, we reach a short list of ingredients and processes that together can make planets and the chemistry of life. The evidence for each step comes from many hands and many tests, from laboratory work to precise measurements of meteorites and to detailed images of disks around other stars. That is the chemistry of existence, the slow hand of the cosmos turning stardust into complexity. I will tell this part of the story as if we are sitting quietly together and watching a slow and patient miracle. The scene is the small and ordinary world of molecules and rocks and water. Somewhere in that plain and steady place, chemistry reached a point where it could begin to do something new. The big question is how a collection of simple chemicals became a system that could copy itself, keep going, and change over time. That change is what we call the origin of life, and it is one of the deepest puzzles science has tried to solve. Over many years, scientists have gathered pieces of evidence and made experiments that turn a mystery into mastery with clear steps, even while some pieces remain unknown. One striking thing about this story is how early life seems to have arrived on our planet. Rocks that are more than 3.5 billion years old already show signs of life or of places where life could thrive. Teams of geologists have found layered rocks and tiny fossil-like structures in very old formations that look a lot like the work of simple microbes, living in warm water long before complex life existed. Those findings do not solve every question, but they do tell us that the jump from chemistry to biology could have happened quite fast once the planet cooled enough to hold steady pools and flowing water. That speed is one reason so many scientists believe the steps from simple chemistry to living systems are chemically plausible and not wildly improbable. What does a chemical system need to become living in the most basic sense? That system needs at least three things. It needs a way to store information so that useful shapes and behaviors can be passed on. It needs a way to use energy to keep working and to make parts. And it needs boundaries so that the useful parts stay together and can act as a unit rather than spreading away. In lab work and in theory, these three needs point toward three simple players. Long molecules that can hold patterns, chemical reactions that run in cycles and transform energy, and thin membranes that make little pockets. When these pieces are present and connected, the stage is set for systems that can copy themselves and that can be shaped by selection. Reviews of origin of life research describe how these three needs guided experimental work for decades and still guide it today. One idea that has held up well and that makes the steps easier to imagine is called the RNA world idea. In this picture, a single kind of molecule did two jobs that later life splits between two kinds of molecules. That one molecule stored patterns like a code and also helped chemical reactions happen. Ribonucleic acid, or RNA, can carry information in a way like a strand of letters, and in some shapes, it can also act like Ateny machine that speeds up particular reactions. If early chemistry made lots of different RNAs, some of them could copy parts of themselves and could help other useful reactions. That double power gives RNA a natural place to start the chain that leads to the first living systems. The idea was named in the 1980s and has been shaped and tested by many experiments since then. A big worry for this idea was whether the kinds of building blocks that RNA needs could form easily in ordinary pre-life chemistry. In recent years, chemists have found chemical paths that make the necessary pieces under realistic early Earth conditions. Work in carefully controlled experiments has shown ways to weave the parts of RNA together from simpler chemicals without needing rare or magical steps. Those results do not prove that nature took exactly those paths on our planet, but they show that plausible chemical routes exist and that the RNA idea has real chemical footing. These findings reduce the feeling that the formation of RNA is fantastical and increase the sense that the step from chemistry to copying molecules was within reach on early Earth. Even if the building blocks are available, another key step is copying. In the lab, researchers have built simple RNA systems that can copy and amplify themselves in conditions that do not include cells. In one famous experiment, 2 RNA enzymes were set up so that each helps make the other, and the pair can keep growing in number. Those synthetic systems show that networks of copying molecules can emerge, and that they can compete and change in ways that mimic evolution. The lab systems are far simpler than any living cell, but they prove a point. Chemistry can produce molecules that replicate and that therefore can be shaped by selection and by chance into more effective forms. That is the heart of how an inanimate set of parts can begin to show the history like patterns that we call life. Once molecular copying exists and little pockets form from thin films of fat-like molecules, the scene changes. Pockets trap the useful molecules and allow them to work together. Some pockets will be better at keeping useful molecules inside or at taking in fresh raw materials. When copying molecules sit inside pockets that divide and grow, the system becomes capable of heredity at a new level. In that way, membranes and copying chemistries make a unit that can be tested by selection. Different pockets or protocells that keep their useful molecules longer or that copy faster will leave more descendants. Over many cycles, this process increases organized complexity. Reviews of how membranes and simple metabolism could have worked together point to places such as shallow pools, mineral-rich springs, or rock pores where chemistry and physical forces made these steps practical. Why did life appear relatively early in Earth history? If the right raw materials were common, and if certain environments could concentrate them, then the steps could run in parallel and quickly. The geological evidence that simple life existed within a few 100 million years after the planet became habitable supports this view. It does not mean every detail is clear. Scientists still debate which exact places and which sets of chemicals did the crucial work, but the combination of geological signs and laboratory chemistry gives a picture where chemistry naturally moves toward systems that can copy use energy and keep themselves together. From those early living systems, the slow process of evolution then takes over. Natural selection favors systems that copy more reliably or that use resources better. Over long stretches of time, this simple filtering can build new capabilities. We can see this in real time in careful experiments with bacteria that have been grown for tens of thousands of generations. In those studies, new traits arise and settle in populations step by step, and organisms become better tuned to their world. That shows how unguided variation plus selection can produce complex changes without a central plan. The same simple rule that works in a lab has, over billions of years, turned single-cell systems into the vast variety of life we know. Some of the most important shifts in this long path are how genetic material and chemistry became specialized. Na-based chemistry makes many things possible, but proteins are far better at doing a wide range of chemical jobs, and DNA is far better at storing stable long-term information. Over time, systems that used RNA for both jobs began to use proteins and DNA because those changes were more versatile and more robust. Those transitions are among the major steps biologists study, and they are the reason modern cells look the way they do, with DNA in the center and proteins as the workhorses. Studies that map these transitions show that complexity builds in steps that each open new possibilities for further change. At the stage when cells could sense and respond, the first roots of awareness in a very broad sense begin. Single cells learn to detect food, to swim toward it, to hide from harm, and to remember short changes in their surroundings. Bacteria use simple circuits to measure changes in chemical levels, and they hold a short lived record of past conditions that guides how they move. These basic sensing and memory systems are not minds, but they are ways for living systems to process information and to act on it. Over long stretches of evolution, those abilities were built on into nervous systems that let animals sense the world with more detail and to plan responses. Studies of simple animals such as cnidarians and of cellular signaling show how gradual additions to sensing and response built the complex machinery that eventually supports inner experience for some animals. If we step back, the path from chemistry to biology looks like a slow chain of small wins. Raw chemicals combined into building blocks. Some combinations gave molecules that could copy. Copies that sat inside fat pockets that could grow and divide became units that selection could act on. Selection over many turns favored better copying, better use of energy, and better ways to sense and to remember. Each advance made the next advance more likely until the living world as we know it unfolded. The work is not done, and many details remain open, but the soft and steady picture is powerful and hopeful. It shows how simple parts under ordinary physical laws can assemble the most remarkable of all things life. I want to tell you a quiet story about how matter learned to think. Picture long ages of simple life, tiny cells drifting in seas and clinging to rocks, and then slowly, a new kind of thing appearing inside life itself. Little by little, some cells changed in ways that let them sense the world and pass messages to one another. Those changes we call the origin of neurons. At first, the signals were basic chemicals moving from one cell to the next. Over time, those chemical messages became faster and more precise, and special parts of cells grew to carry them. Modern studies that look across many kinds of animals and that read whole genomes now show that the roots of the nervous system go very deep, and that there are many ways a simple signaling network can become a true nervous system. These ideas are spelled out in recent reviews that trace the deep evolutionary roots of neurons and nervous systems. Imagine a single cell that could reach out and touch its neighbor with a tiny finger of membrane and then send a signal back. That touch could be the first hint of a neuron. Over many generations, some cells became better at sending and receiving signals. They grew long, thin arms called axons and tiny branches called dendrites, so signals could travel over space inside an animal. Inside those cells, the chemistry that used to run whole bodies in a slow way was repurposed to carry quick messages. The change was not a sudden invention, but a long making where small shifts in cell shape and in the proteins they use led to big new abilities. Scientists studying simple animals and single-celled cousins of animals find shared genes and signals that suggest this step was built on pieces that already existed for other jobs. That is why many researchers now speak of a gradual assembly of neurons from older cell parts. As more cells joined into groups that could signal each other, networks emerged. A network of neurons is like a neighborhood where each house can ring the others and pass along news. At first, the news was short and local. A touch on one side might make a muscle on the other side move. That early kind of network gave any animal a way to sense the world and to act on it quickly. The first nervous systems helped animals find food and avoid being eaten, and that small benefit was enough for natural selection to favor more and better networks. Over time, the wiring grew more complex and cells took on special roles. Some became fast messengers, some became local guards, some became pattern detectors. The result was a system that could pair sensing and doing in rich ways, and that made new behavior possible. Recent reviews gather evidence from fossils, from genomes, and from living simple animals to show how networks of neurons became the basic toolkit for animal life. Brains appear where the demands of life push for faster and smarter ways of dealing with the world. When an animal lives in a place where food is hidden, where predators are quick, or where mates are hard to find, being able to sense more and decide faster helps. Brains let animals combine many signals in one place and make better choices. In social animals, the same kind of pressure comes from living with others. Keeping track offrends, rivals, and alliances takes a kind of mental bookkeeping, and that can favor bigger and better brains. Classic work on the social brain idea links the size and wiring of brains to the complexity of social life. And later, studies that examine development and anatomy show how changes in growth and in wiring can produce the rich brains we see in some animals. One of the clearest changes that helped humans think in new ways was the strengthening of connections between parts of the brain that handle sound and those that handle action and planning. In simple terms, the brain built better highways connecting areas that store words and meanings to areas that let us plan and speak. This kind of wiring helps explain how we learn words quickly and how we can take a sound and turn it into a complex plan to make a sentence. Studies that compare human brains with the brains of other primates show that some of these pathways are much larger or more direct in humans, and this change likely helped language grow into the powerful tool it is for sharing ideas and for shaping thought. Language is not the whole story, but it is a huge one. Words let us label things, hold ideas in memory, and pass complex recipes for thinking from one person to another. With words we can make mental models of the world that are more exact and can be shared. That capacity opened new ways of planning and imagining and of building knowledge across generations. At the same time, brains grew better at building internal models of what might happen next. A useful modern way to say this is that brains became prediction machines. The mind does not only wait for the world to tell it things, it uses past experience to expect what will come and then checks when the world surprises it. This style of working helps save energy and lets animals react fast to small differences that matter. Reviews of predictive processing and of mathematical ideas about the brain show how this pattern helps explain perception, learning, and action in simple words. Finally, we reach the question of consciousness, that inner life we all feel. Many researchers now look for the neural patterns that go with being aware and find that certain networks and their interactions seem especially linked to conscious experience. Ideas such as integrated information point to how the way parts of the brain share and combine information matters for having a unified moment of experience. Reviews of the neural correlates of consciousness gather many studies that link specific brain regions and their dynamics to awareness. These studies do not yet solve the deepest puzzle of why experience feels like something from the inside, but they do show how complexity and rich integration of signals are part of the story. There are also bold ideas that try to link consciousness to physical processes, we normally keep in separate boxes. A well-known proposal suggests that quantum processes inside tiny parts of the cell could play a role in awareness. That idea has been explored and debated in peer-reviewed work and has attracted both interest and strong criticism. Some calculations argue that the warm, wet brain will destroy delicate quantum states too quickly for them to matter for thinking. Others point to new work in quantum biology that shows nature can sometimes use quantum tricks. The honest view is that this is a lively area of debate, and that we need clearer experiments to know whether quantum processes are part of how brains make minds, or whether ordinary electrical and chemical activity is enough to explain our inner life. If you step back from the detail, the sweep is calming and grand. Small changes in single cells led to the first neurons. Networks of those cells became bodies that could sense and move. Brains grew where the world demanded fast and flexible responses. In our branch of life, a long chain of changes in size, wiring, and culture created the special mix that lets us speak, plan, and imagine. The work of many scientists today is to map those steps in more detail and to test the bold ideas that remain open. The quiet beauty of this story is that from simple beginnings and patient change, the universe made a place where matter learned to think about itself. I want to tell you a quiet story about how the universe might have learned to look at itself. Imagine the long dark sky as a slow dream that over billions of years grew the eyes and minds that now watch it. This is not a claim that the stars suddenly woke up. It is a way of seeing a chain of events that begins with simple physics and ends, at least for now, in beings that can ask why anything exists in the first place. The idea that the act of observing matters for what we call reality was explored in depth by the physicist John Wheeler, who suggested that observers play a participatory role in the unfolding of the world rather than being mere passive witnesses. Wheeler argued that ideas from quantum theory and information might mean observation is woven into the way the universe shows itself. Saying that the universe becomes self-aware by making creatures that can think is, at heart, a poetic way to describe a very practical chain. Simple physical laws let matter and energy make structures. Those structures, under the right conditions, became stars and planets. On at least one of those planets, the chemistry grew rich enough that life began. Life over time built nervous systems and then minds. Those minds now study the sky, measure ancient light, and tell stories about how things began. In this long cause and effect, the small act of looking and the slow work of thinking are the latest links in the chain. Scientists and philosophers treat the idea differently. Some treat it as a useful metaphor about our place in the cosmos. Others ask whether the link between observation and reality in quantum mechanics points to a deeper truth about the role of mind. Both views are part of the same human conversation. To speak clearly about how a mind might be connected to physical reality, we need a simple map of what scientists now think consciousness is. Two influential scientific ideas help here. One says that conscious experience grows from the way parts of a system share information and make a unified whole. This idea has been developed as integrated information theory, which tries to show when and why a physical system would have an inner life in the sense of a unified set of experiences. The other idea comes from brain science and says that conscious content becomes global inside the brain when a set of networks work together so that many parts of the mind can access the same information. This global neuronal workspace view helps us understand how a thought becomes available to memory, to speech, and to action. Both approaches are rooted in lab work and careful measurement. They do not claim to answer every question about inner feeling, but they give concrete ways to study how brain activity lines up with being aware. But there is more. Some thinkers have taken a very different route and suggested that the basic stuff of the world might include the kind of raw stuff that becomes mind. This family of views asks whether consciousness is in some sense fundamental and woven into the world at a deep level. If that were true, then minds would be the universe becoming conscious of itself, rather than just a late byproduct of complex brains. Philosophers and scientists debate this idea fiercely because it moves us from testable brain processes into harder questions about the nature of reality and what counts as evidence. The discussion touches on deep puzzles known as the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem asks why there is something it is like to be a system that functions in certain ways, and it pushes thoughtful people to consider whether our usual tools are enough to finish the job. A striking scientific response to the doubt about whether consciousness could be tied to basic physics comes from a line of work that links quantum ideas to mind. Some researchers have proposed that tiny structures inside cells might use quantum processes in ways that matter for conscious moments. These ideas go under various names and have been reviewed openly in scientific journals. For some people, these proposals are exciting because they suggest a bridge between the mysteries of quantum theory and the mystery of subjective experience. For others, the proposals are hard to accept because the brain is warm and wet in a way that normally destroys delicate quantum states quickly. Careful work has therefore pushed both the bold proposals and the critiques so that the debate can be grounded in calculation and experiment rather than only in speculation. It is important to be honest about the state of the science. The models that tie consciousness to patterns of information and to global brain dynamics are backed by many experiments that measure brain signals and link them to reports of awareness. They show how attention memory and widely shared brain activity line up with what people say they experience. The more radical proposals that aim to connect mind with quantum structure are interesting and have inspired new experiments and ideas, but they remain contested and in need of clearer direct evidence. The scientific spirit is at work here in the best way, testing assumptions and letting data guide the next steps. When we return to the larger idea that the universe woke up, we face a final layer of meaning. If mind is an emergent process that needs complex parts wired in special ways, then the universe did not become conscious as a whole. It made places where consciousness could emerge, and then, through those local minds, it began to see aspects of itself. If consciousness is in some sense basic, then the universe was always primed to know itself whenever the right arrangements appeared. Either way, the human act of asking questions, the patient labor of building telescopes, and the long, slow work of science can be read as part of the cosmos gradually making a map of itself. The act of discovery is then both a human achievement and, in a poetic sense, a kind of cosmic reflection. Wheeler and others have pressed this idea seriously as a way to think about the role of observation in physics, and to remind us that what we call reality and what we can know about it are deeply entwined. The quiet and soft beauty of this story is not that it gives a final answer. It is that it changes how we feel about being observers. When we look out into the stars, we are not only learning facts about distant light and dust. We are using brains that grew from the same material history as the stars to read a universe written in light. That shared history makes the act of science into a kind of self-portrait drawn by nature, using us as brushes and eyes. Scientific work continues to sharpen which parts of this picture are testable and which remain in the realm of deep thought. The tests show real mechanisms in brains and real limits to quantum ideas in warm matter. The thought experiments remind us to keep asking why inner experience is part of our story at all. Together, they give a gentle and grounded sense of wonder. In the end, the language of a conscious universe can be read in two plain ways. One is the humble view that life and mind are late but wonderful products of a universe that makes structure when conditions allow it. The other is the bolder view that mind and matter are not separate, and that the universe in some deep way contains the seeds of self-knowing. Both views invite us to keep looking carefully and to listen kindly as science and philosophy talk to one another. The questions are large and patient. The work of many careful studies has already given us a map that brings the universe and our own inner lives closer together. The rest is an invitation to keep the conversation going with open eyes and honest methods. I want to take you by the hand and walk slowly through how our curious minds learn to read the story written in the sky. Imagine a quiet room where someone points a long metal tube at a bright dot, and then explains that the dot is not just a dot, but an old light that carries a memory of a time long before anyone was there to watch. Dot telescopes are those graceful tools that stretch our eyes outward and backward. They gather faint streams of light and hold them steady long enough for us to see shapes and patterns that are ancient. Some telescopes listen to the oldest whisper of the cosmos, the faint glow left from the first hot moments after the universe began, and others look at the red-shifted glow from the first baby galaxies. Together they let us travel in time with our sight and slowly fill the empty pages of cosmic history with facts and pictures. When we say that light is a messenger, we mean something very simple. Light leaves an object and carries with it the record of the things that made that light. A bright ball of gas gives us one kind of color and pattern, a cold cloud of dust gives another, and a distant galaxy gives a blend that tells us how old and how heavy it is. Instruments attached to telescopes do more than make pretty pictures. They separate light into thin bands like a rainbow. In those thin bands we see marks that act like name tags for different atoms. Those name tags are fingerprints that allow us to say which atoms were there and in what amounts. Modern observatories in space and on high dry mountains give us spectra with fine detail, and let scientists map the chemical histories of whole galaxies. Reading those fingerprints is a craft with deep roots. For more than a century, astronomers have learned to read tiny dark or bright lines in the light and to match them with the precise colors that atoms and ions make. Laboratories on Earth measure those same colors under controlled conditions, so that when a telescope shows a line at a certain place, we can say with confidence which atom made it. That work has grown into a robust field, where teams compile atomic data, test models, and run surveys of hundreds of thousands of stars. The result is a clear map that ties the light we see to the elements that were born in different cosmic ovens. In plain terms, spectroscopy turns color into story, and lets us say, for example, that a certain star is rich in carbon or poor in iron, and that those properties reflect a history of past stellar generations. The story those spectral fingerprints tell leads us to the heart of stars. Inside ordinary stars, simple hydrogen atoms fuse into helium and slowly build heavier atoms step by step. The long, careful work of nuclear physics and stellar modeling showed that different kinds of stars make different elements at different stages. Massive stars living fast and hot build the midweight elements in their cores, and then, when they die in a roar, they scatter those creations across space. Smaller stars puff off layers rich in carbon and other products, and when neutron-rich events happen, they make the heaviest metals in sudden, extreme ways. The classic synthesis of these ideas was put together by pioneers who first showed that stars are factories of the elements, and later work has refined and extended that view. So we now have a layered, nuanced picture of where each atom comes from. If we want a direct sample of that ancient work, we need to look in the laboratory on Earth. Some meteorites carry within them tiny grains that formed long ago in the outflows of dying stars or in supernova explosions. These presolar grains are actual bits of stardust that never lost their identity when the solar system formed. Scientists extract them and measure isotopes and trace elements with instruments that can count single atoms. Those measurements are like letters in a fossil diary. They tell us that material made in different kinds of stars mixed together in the cloud that became our sun and planets. In another line of study, scientists use precise clocks based on radioactive decay to pin down when the earliest solid pieces of our system formed. Those dates show that the solar nebula condensed into rocks and planet seeds about 4.5 billion years ago, and they give us a firm footing for connecting the cosmic past to the birth of Earth. When we stand under that larger picture and look at our own bodies, we find the same letters written there. The oxygen we breathe and the carbon in our cells came from several generations of stars that lived and died before the sun. Some of the heaviest atoms found in our bodies and in the Earth were forged in rare violent events, where neutron-rich matter made sudden and fast captures that build heavy nuclei. Astronomers have even watched one such kind of event in recent years where two dead star cores collided, and the glow that followed matched the fingerprints of freshly made heavy elements. This is not poetry alone. It is a chain of laboratory work, telescope measurements, and careful comparison that links the oxygen in a breath to an event far across space and time. All these discoveries sit within the steady practice of the scientific method and its social forms like peer review. theme that is simple in idea and messy in practice. It asks us to form ideas that can be tested, to make predictions, to check those predictions with instruments and experiments, and then to let the result shape what we think next. Peer review adds a layer of reality checking. Colleagues read one another's work carefully before it joins the public record so that mistakes are caught and claims are sharpened. Science grows not because any one person is right, but because many people from different places and times test the same ideas and build on what survives the test. That communal practice is what makes our maps of the universe trustworthy, and why the story of our cosmic origins is not just a dream, but a chain of well-tested steps. If you let the thought sit with you gently, it settles into a small quiet wonder. The light that first flickered near the beginning of time eventually bent into patterns that our instruments could catch. Those patterns, broken into colors and counted and measured, told a story about atoms and fires and explosions. Dust from long-dead stars landed in a cloud that became our sun, and the tiny rounds of rock that later made this planet. The same chemistry that made the rocks also made the chains of molecules that built life, and the brains that now read this text. The tools we have built are really extensions of our curiosity. Telescopes and spectrometers and isotope labs become the senses of a species that wants to know where it came from and what it is made of. In that gentle turning of science toward the sky, we become, in the kindest sense, the universe learning its own story. When we talk about quantum consciousness, we are really asking whether the smallest rules of nature have anything to do with the bright inner life we each carry. It is a tender question. It asks if the whisper of a single particle could matter to a thought, a memory, a felt sense of being. It also asks us to be careful. We need solid tests, measured claims, and clear language. So let us walk slowly, in plain words, through what scientists know, what they are trying to find out, and why any of this might matter to the story of mind. First, a few simple ideas. Quantum mechanics is the set of rules that describe how very small things behave. These rules are strange, but very well tested. They say that a tiny object can be in more than one state at once. They say two objects can be linked so that a change in one shows up when you look at the other, even when far apart. They say that the act of measuring matters. None of this, by itself, explains a single feeling. But these rules do help us frame careful questions about life and mind. One place where the questions are being tested is inside neurons. Neurons are the cells that carry signals in the brain. Inside them are stiff scaffolds called microtubules. These are long protein tubes that help the cell keep its shape and move cargo. For many years, two researchers have argued that microtubules might also host special quantum events that, when organized, could add up to moments of experience. Their idea is called orchestrated objective reduction, or ORCH-OR for short. It is bold. It makes predictions that can be checked. And it has drawn strong criticism and strong interest in equal measure. A widely cited review lays out the theory and the ways it might be tested, including how anesthetic drugs might act on microtubules in ways tied to consciousness. New experiments have started to probe that link. In a study published in Neuro, researchers worked with rats and found that a drug that stabilizes microtubules can delay the loss of purposeful behavior caused by a common gas anesthetic. Their results suggest that the anesthetic binds to microtubules, and that this binding helps bring about unconsciousness. That does not prove that microtubules host the essence of mind. But it is clear, peer-reviewed evidence that these structures are a real target of drugs that switch awareness off, which is exactly the sort of concrete anchor such a theory needs. There is, however, a serious challenge. Quantum states are delicate. In warm and wet settings like the brain, they tend to lose their special features very quickly. A classic calculation in a leading physics journal argued that quantum states in neurons would fall apart far too fast to influence thought. This argument supports a more standard view that the brain can be understood as a complex, but mostly classical machine. The debate remains open and motivates better measurements of how long quantum effects can last in real biological structures. So, can living systems keep quantum effects alive long enough to matter? In some cases, the answer seems to be yes. For example, The tiny machines that harvest light during photosynthesis show patterns that look like waves of energy exploring many paths at once. Experiments in Nature and in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences have reported signs of such quantum coherence. The signals are brief, but they are long enough to help guide energy toward the place where it is used. Later work asks how much this effect improves efficiency at body temperature, and the discussion is ongoing, which is how science should be. Bird navigation offers another window. Many birds seem to sense the direction of Earth's magnetic field. One leading explanation uses a chemical reaction that briefly creates a pair of molecules with linked electron spins in the eye. This is called the radical pair mechanism. Reviews and experiments in major journals have shown that to respond to such weak fields, the reaction must preserve quantum features such as coherence, and in some models even entanglement of the paired spins for a meaningful time. Whether entanglement itself is used by the animals is still being tested, but the core point is that biology can, at least in some systems, maintain and use delicate quantum behavior. What does all of this have to do with you sitting here reading these words? At minimum, it shows that life is nodallergic to the quantum world. Under the right conditions, biological structures can host and even exploit quantum effects. That does not mean the brain uses the same tricks as a plant or a robin. It does mean we should not rule out quantum contributions to neural function just because the brain is warm and busy. The proper stance is to ask what is present, how long it lasts, how it couples to the classical signals neurons already use, and whether such coupling makes any difference one can measure. Now let us come back to the oldest and perhaps most unsettling quantum lesson. In many textbook experiments, the behavior you observe depends on what you choose to measure. Physicists have devised clever tests where the choice of what to measure is made after the particle has started its journey. These delayed choice experiments have been carried out with light, with atoms, and even across long distances. They agree with quantum theory and show that outcomes are not fixed in the simple way our common sense suggests. This does not say that a human mind creates reality. It does say that in the quantum world, the line between the system and the act of measuring it is part of the story. This is where philosophy enters, not to cloud the view, but to help us speak clearly about what the experiments tell us. Some physicists stress that an observer can be any physical device. A mind is not required for a measurement. Yet even these careful accounts keep the observer in the equations, because quantum theory is a theory of what is seen when certain questions are asked of nature. A recent paper in a high-profile journal looked again at how the rules of quantum theory talk about observers and measurements, and it put the role of the observer at the center of the formalism. Once more, this is not proof that consciousness is fundamental. It is a reminder that the way we frame questions to the world matters to the answers we get. What follows from all this for the idea of quantum consciousness? First, there is a careful path between two cliffs. On one side is the cliff of wishful thinking, where any mystery of mind is simply waved away as quantum magic. On the other side is the cliff of dismissal, where anything quantum in the brain is declared impossible by assumption. The careful path asks for specific predictions and tests. It welcomes results that cut against favored ideas. It respects the power of standard neuroscience while staying open to new physics where evidence requires it. Second, there is value in comparing quantum-based ideas with grounded models of conscious access. The global neuronal workspace view, for example, explains how a pattern of brain activity becomes widely available to many parts of the cortex and thus enters awareness. Recent work has even set up head-to-head tests to challenge such models. None of these studies rely on quantum effects, and yet they capture many features of what we report when we become aware of a picture, a word, or a scene. This tells us that any quantum story of consciousness must connect to these macroscopic dynamics rather than replace them. Third, we can sketch a practical research agenda in plain terms. Measure how anesthetics interact with microtubules and other neural proteins in living brains. Map whether those interactions track with reliable markers of consciousness. Push on the physics side to learn how long any quantum states can survive in these environments and how they couple to known neural signals like spike timing and synaptic changes. Keep using lessons from photosynthesis and bird navigation to design tests in the brain that could reveal similar quantum lifelines. All of this can be done without overclaiming. All of it can also surprise us. For those who hope quantum theory will unite mind and world, the best kind of hope is patient and empirical. A clear example is the anesthetic study mentioned earlier. It supports a concrete part of a larger theory without claiming to solve the whole puzzle. OR remains a daring proposal, still waiting on decisive tests that show long-lived and functionally relevant quantum states in neural microtubules. Critics of the theory have made strong points about fast decoherence. Supporters have found new ways to probe and perhaps lengthen their Levant timescales. Only better experiments will decide how far quantum effects reach into the brain.